Hello, this is a short recording about the Erector spinae. Erector spinae is an intrinsic muscle of the back, and it's very large. It has one big broad origin that where three parts of the muscle all blend together, and then superiorly they separate into three separate columns. The three separate columns are, starting from lateral to medial, Iliocostalis, longissimus, and spinalis. And each of these is subdivided into different parts depending on the region of the body that they're located. So Iliocostalis, for example, has a lumborum, a thoracis portion, and a services portion. Okay. Longissimus has thoracis, services, and capitis. And spinalis has those same three parts, although we don't typically talk about a capitis for the spinalis portion, and I'll explain why in a minute. Being an intrinsic muscle of the back, the erector spinae, like all intrinsic muscles, is innervated by dorsal rami of spinal nerves. It is not the most superficial of the erector spinae, of the intrinsic muscles of the back, The splenius muscle is located superficial to the erector spinae in the upper thoracic and cervical regions. There are also a couple layers of muscles that are intrinsic to the back located deep to the erector spinae, like transversospinal, which includes multifidus, and small segmental muscles like intertransversarii. Okay, let's start with the iliocostalis muscle. So Iliocostalis lumborum is this really large, has this really large origin from the ilium, right? So the iliac crest, ilio for costalis should suggest to you that it's coming from the iliac bone, the ilium. So iliac crest, the sacrum, and spinous processes of all lumbar vertebrae, and usually T12 and maybe T11 spinous process as well. And usually there's some attachment to the transverse processes of lumbar vertebrae. Okay, the lumborum portion of the iliocostalis column of the erector spinae has an insertion on the costal angles of the lower six ribs. So it's going to have a little fibers that come to each of these costal angles, and they all connect like this. So that's the iliocostalis lumborum. The next portion of iliocostalis is the thoracis portion. And the thoracis portion takes origin from the costal angles of the lower six ribs and inserts on the costal angles of the upper six ribs. And it often has an attachment to C7 spinous process. Transverse process. So we'll have this big column of muscles that goes all the way up to C7 transverse process, and attachments to the same ribs where lumborum took origin, and then insertions on the upper six ribs, and maybe a little bit to the C7 transverse process. So that is Iliocostalis thoracis. Let's get another shade of green. That might be too light. The third and final portion of Iliocostalis is Iliocostalis Services, and that is going to take origin from the costal angles of ribs about 3 to 6, and then inserts on transverse processes of cervical vertebrae C4 to C6. So ribs 3 to 6. And then going up to transverse processes 4 to 6. There we go. And that's Iliocostalis Services. Okay. Longissimus. Let's make the longissimus muscles shades of blue. Longissimus the Thoracis portion will have an origin that blends with the origin of Iliocostalis lumborum. You can't really tell them all apart. It does have a specific attachment to the transverse processes of lumbar vertebrae. So we'll have it coming off here, and then its fibers go up, and it actually inserts on the transverse processes of all thoracic vertebrae, as well as the adjacent parts of the ribs. So basically the rib just lateral to the costal tubercle. So that's longissimus thoracis. The longissimus services part takes origin from the transverse processes of T1 to T5 and inserts on the transverse processes in the cervical region, so C2 to C6-ish. So we'll have this going up like this. Okay, so that is longissimus services. But longissimus also has a capitis portion, and the capitis portion also has an origin from T1 to T5 transverse processes, but that origin continues up into the cervical region. And comes off the transverse processes of about C4, 5, 6, and 7. Right? And this, being a capitis, right, means it has to insert on the skull. It wraps up and goes to the mastoid process. We've already seen splenius capitis attaching to the mastoid process, and now we have longissimus capitis going to the mastoid process. The last column of the Erector spinae is the Spinalis column. Spinalis thoracis will have an origin that again blends with the origins of longissimus thoracis and Iliocostalis lumborum. Spinalis thoracis will come off the spinous processes of about T10 to L2 vertebrae. And it will ascend and insert on the spinous processes of about T1 to T8 vertebrae. So all the way up, it pretty much hugs the spinous processes. There we go. So this is Spinalis thoracis. There's also a Spinalis Services muscle. It is pretty variable. Everyone will agree that it does not attach to the atlas, but exactly how high up seems to be quite variable. So it usually takes origin from maybe T1 or T2 spinous process and goes up to C2. So it just does this. But how many cervical vertebrae are connected seems to be highly variable from person to person. And that is your Spinalis Services. Spinalis capitis blends with the underlying semispinalis capitis. And you can't really differentiate the two, and it is convention to go by the name semispinalis capitis for this grouping rather than spinalis. So we're not going to deal with the spinalis capitis. We'll just look at these ones. Okay, so these are the three columns of the erector spinae. Spinalis, most medial, going from spinous process to spinous process. Longissimus in the middle, going from transverse process to transverse process. And iliocostalis, most laterally, going from rib to rib. They are all innervated by dorsal rami of spinal nerves, which I've already stated. And dorsal rami typically emerge in the gap between the longissimus and the iliocostalis muscle, so that's where you'll see them in lab. And as in terms of their actions, if you contract them bilaterally, so both sides, then you get extension of the back. It's an important muscle for posture. And the capitis fibers can extend the head. Unilateral contraction gives you lateral flexion of the vertebral column, so side bend. And for the mastoid process, the longissimus capitis can also rotate the head ipsilaterally.